events in other parts of the world, including the Middle East. A real delight to have with us Richard Marles, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Defence of Australia. Australia has a perfectly impeccable record of every year sending their defence minister to the Shangri-La Dialogue, whatever the electoral realities might have been in the days or weeks immediately preceding its holding. And it's wonderful to have again Dr. Khalid Mohammed Al Attiyah, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of State for Defence Affairs of Qatar, who's appearing for the second time at the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue. So perspective also from the Middle East. With that, could I invite Hishamuddin to take the podium and address the IISS third plenary of the Shangri-La Dialogue.
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My brother, His Excellency Dr. Khalid bin Mohammed Al Attiyah, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of State for Defence for the State of Qatar. Your Excellency Richard Marles, Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Defence of Australia. My friend Dr. John Chipman. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I've been asked to speak on developing new forms of security cooperation, a topic which is timely considering a lot has changed in the past 2 years. COVID-19 ravaged the lives and livelihoods of millions around the world, and the onset of the Ukraine-Russia conflict has triggered seismic repercussions. These two events alone have impacted on all of us. It has done so regionally, globally, in ways way beyond the security realm, pushing existing arrangements and partnerships to the limit, as well as revealing gaps and vulnerabilities we must address collectively in the post-pandemic era. The question now is, what are our common challenges that necessitate security cooperation? And I believe there's four. An increase in transboundary crime for border reopenings, an upsurge in online disinformation arising from terror groups and extremists, the continued threat of biological warfare, and finally, food security that is giving rise to instability worldwide. As nations recover from COVID-19 and reopening their borders, people to people, boost tourism, increase businesses, the threat of illegal migration, and transboundary crime is expected to increase. This is the dark side of reopening borders, which many seem to ignore, but is something we in this forum cannot and must not deny. Second challenge, the proliferation of cyber attacks and the online war. We cannot deny humanity's overwhelming preoccupation with COVID-19 over the past 2 years. The constant media coverage and attention lulled many into false sense of security, with the lack of exposure giving the impression that these threats had slowed down or even disappeared. Unfortunately, neither was the case. In a world which has become considerably more digital, targeting the propagation of hatred and violent ideologies spread online is an imperative. The widespread uncertainty and global anxiety represent for terror groups a golden opportunity to combine their wicked narrative and falsehood about COVID-19. These were pursued through a coordinated disinformation campaign such as conspiracy theories about the vaccines, claims of God's vengeance against the non-believers, and even accusations of weaponizing the virus. This serves as a reminder that we must continue to be vigilant in our fight against extremism and can ill afford to take our eyes off this war. You can be sure that dangerous people will always pounce on any laxity on our part. Third is the threat of biological warfare. We have seen firsthand how COVID-19, an unseen virus, brought nations to their knees. It has definitely reminded us of our vulnerabilities, and indeed, even to this very day, we are still trying to rebuild and recover from the devastating impacts of COVID-19 that left us. I have no doubt that our adversaries have been paying attention to how challenging it has been for us to respond. The struggles we as nations went through in the first few months, I'm sure many of us remember. Our focus shifted completely. Expenditure were redirected to healthcare. Meetings had to realign to focus on how best to bring our daily numbers down. But behind the scenes, potential enemies saw the sheer scale of devastation this unseen virus brought and were planning their next steps. Yes, I might be scaremongering, but isn't it our duty, ladies and gentlemen, to always hope for the best and prepare for the worst? Fourth, and very topically, is the fact that food insecurity threatens societies and exacerbates conflicts. Indeed, no country is immune to this. COVID-19 has already been and broken supply chains where national lockdowns have halted the flow of food, supplies, and raw goods. Now the Ukraine-Russia conflict is making the situation much worse. Commodity price volatility has surged, with food prices reaching levels not seen since 2007. But why, some of you may wonder, am I highlighting food security in the Shangri-La dialogue? How does that link to security and defense? Let's look back just 10 years ago, when people took to the streets of Tunisia, Egypt, and elsewhere in the world. Protesters were not only crying out for freedom and social justice, but they were also crying out for bread. The cost of pantry staples had jumped because of skyrocketing prices of goods like wheat, stoking fury, warranted or otherwise, against governments. Now, the combination of unhappiness from 2 years of the pandemic and rising food prices may push our people over the edge, generating a wave of political instability, with potential riots and protests affecting the security environments of our nation. In Sri Lanka, protests have erupted over shortages of gas and other basic goods. Double-digit inflation in Pakistan also arguably contributed to the recent change of the government there. Peru has likewise been rocked by anti-government demonstrations sparked by rising fuel prices, which have sadly resulted in a number of deaths. Unrest in certain parts of the world could lead to security threats to all of us. It is now obvious that threats are no longer confined to political factors, but, ladies and gentlemen, also to economic considerations. But I believe that worse may yet to come. The damage in Ukraine, a major exporter of many basic commodities, as well as harsh sanctions on Russia, is expected to spur further price increases in the coming months. The conflict is in Europe, but the implications and damage is global. Like it or not, food security is critical to peace and stability. There are no two ways about it. Ladies and gentlemen, despite the severity of these challenges, I do, however, believe there is a window of opportunity to put in place mechanisms to combat the risks that I have highlighted. We are responsible for the safety and security of our countries. So who better to lead the way of preventing, mitigating, and ultimately managing yet another crisis, another COVID, so to speak. But why here, in the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore? Why now? It comes back to the Chinese saying by Zhuangzi, you can't discuss the ocean with a well frog because he is limited by the space that he lives in. And you can't discuss ice with a summer insect because he is bound by a single season. The Shangri-La Dialogue is in essence an ocean of all seasons. The perfect gathering of minds and leaders to deliberate and address our pressing security challenges. And it's up to us to come up with fresh approaches together. I strongly believe that the first step is to strengthen our regional architecture. By promoting practical cooperation between our nations is paramount. Collective solutions are essentials, and I would just like to highlight two focal points. Firstly, strengthening sub-regional approaches, and secondly, enhancing confidence and trust-building measures. Ladies and gentlemen, people, and by extension countries, have often been at war with one another for various reasons. There is little sign that the 21st century will be any different. But it is cooperation that has kept the world running. Following the Second World War, multilateral organizations and regional blocs have occupied pride of place in the global system, which was largely characterized by cooperation and collaboration. However, we have seen that as groupings get too large, consensus making to solve real-time issues have been impeded. This is not to say that we have ceased investing in traditional multilateral and regional institutions, such as ASEAN, the United Nations, and APEC. Rather, we have also come to recognize the value of engaging smaller, more targeted, groups that share a common threat, as well as a common understanding of the ways and means to mitigate those challenges. It is my firm belief that the foundations of wider security cooperation can be laid via smaller building blocks, such as sub-regional cooperation initiatives. The key is to adopt a gradualist approach. An example of that is the close to my heart, the trilateral cooperation arrangement, forged by Malaysia, Indonesia, and Philippines, following a spat of kidnappings and terrorist activities by militant groups in mid-2016. Undeniably, the three nations already share close multifaceted ties. But the TCA materialized because of a common threat, sharing a common sea with a common aim. We showed that the world that a sub-regional cooperation, or as I like to call it, mini-lateralism, is the key forward. Case in point was the 0 incidence of kidnapping for ransom reported in 2021. Just in March early this year, the 3 defense ministers, Pak Prabowo of Indonesia, Secretary Delfin of the Philippines, and I, had our first in-person TCA ministerial meeting since the pandemic. Immediately, we pledged to increase trilateral maritime exercises, strengthen intelligence sharing, and explore an expansion to land-based exercises. More importantly, we agreed to incorporate Brunei, elevating into our sub-regional quad. Of course, this would require the consent of His Majesty the Sultan of Brunei. But our idea was simple. Bringing in Brunei would help the TCA become the security support needed for the Brunei, Philippines, Malaysia, East Asian Growth Area, BIMPEAGA, BIMIAGA, a cooperation initiative established in 1994 to spur development in the 4 nations. The 3-pronged approach of cooperation cutting across security, including economic and the political sphere, is what has enabled the TCA to serve as an effective platform to better safeguard the safety and stability of the strategic but vulnerable Sulu and the Sulawesi Seas. The Malacca Straits, the Sea of Malacca. The Malacca Straits Patrol, MSP, for its part, has borne out of the mutual recognition by Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore, and Thailand, that we have shared a common need to secure the Straits of Malacca. Now, Dr. Eng Heng, DPM Prawit, Pak Prabowo, and myself have agreed to elevate the MSP to a ministerial dialogue to further strengthen our cooperation in this regard. The TCA and MSP are just 2 examples how smaller, more targeted groupings that share a common thread can come together through close coordination and cooperation to mitigate a common and joint security concern. It may not be a new form of security cooperation per se, but one which I think is worth considering and perhaps replicable across the board. However, the linchpin in ensuring the success of these sub-regional cooperation initiatives is the trust and confidence required between all the participating members. The South China Sea. Malaysia is more than aware of what is at stake, which is why we have consistently advocated that diplomacy takes precedence in approaching this dispute. It is not alarmist to say that it could degenerate into one of the deadliest conflicts of our time, if not history. Mutual trust and respect have thus far allowed us to recognize that we are in this together, that our bloc of 10 countries must stand united if we are sincere in our efforts to address the various challenges ahead of us. As individual nations, we cannot hope to match the influence and might of the more powerful countries. But as a bloc, only the foolish and the blind can deny our strength. Now, ladies and gentlemen, nevertheless, it's only prudent for our optimism to be guarded. We have seen firsthand with the Ukraine-Russian conflict how organizations like NATO are tested. Members of NATO have met Russian invasions of Ukraine with outrage, deploying thousands of troops to Eastern Europe to protect their alliance members. Even though Ukraine is not a member of the alliance, the potential of the conflict sparking into a much larger war does exist, and the fear of it becoming a reality is conceivable, as much as we want to deny it. These uncertainties prompt us to the question today, are existing forms of security cooperation still beneficial as a deterrent? Or will they actually escalate existing conflicts? So before we can even deliberate our new forms of security cooperation, shouldn't we find the answers to these questions first? To conclude, in discussing about new forms of security cooperation, we must come to the realization that our existing structures are not enough. We may not have quick answers at hand, but security cooperation itself cannot merely be considered a panacea. Yes, security cooperation in any form is an important pillar of defense strategy, but our reach must exceed beyond our grasp. In a world that is blinkered with populist decisions, with an eye only on the next election, it's important for us today to bring ourselves to the ground and truly think about a more peaceful and stable future. You may be asking, why have I raised all these challenges today in the香格里拉dialogue? As Benjamin Franklin once said, life's tragedy is that we get old too soon and wise too late. Who hasn't had the thought that we wish we could know then what we know now? We are in a game for optimists, and we cannot afford another global conflict. What we in the defense and international relations sphere must exhibit in our leadership and vision is to learn from the mistakes of the past, to resolve the conflicts of the present and prevent those of the future. This is not the work of one generation, but rather a legacy that must be consistently followed through. I have consistently mentioned that we, all of us here as security and defense practitioners, now find ourselves at a crossroads. The choice is for us to either chart and shape a new post-pandemic era, one that is mutually beneficial for all, or we can just simply return to the old days. We must strive to be better. We must embark on a new area of security cooperation. One focused on actionable deliverables, in essence, raising the bar, not simply reacting to danger, but working strategically and working smarter and, most importantly, working together. I leave you with a popular Chinese proverb that says, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. If you haven't yet, the second best time is now. Basically, in the context of our deliberation today, this means that we want peace and stability in the future, and the best time is now, John, for us to plant the tree. Thank you. Sekian wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Hishamuddin, for a typically thoughtful and subtle set of remarks, an important early reminder that food security is indeed a subject that should be legitimately addressed by defense ministers because human security is so important. And a second reminder that when organizations become too large to manage all problems, it is proper to form specific groups to address particular problems. Thank you very much for that. Deputy Prime Minister, Defense Minister of Australia, the floor is yours.
Three weeks ago, Australians elected a new government under the leadership of Anthony Albanese. And so it's my honour today to represent Australia at this, the 19th Shangri-La Dialogue as the new Deputy Prime Minister, and Minister for Defence. My thanks to Director General and Chief Executive of IISS, Dr. John Chipman, for the invitation to speak to you today. And I also want to thank Singapore for hosting this time-honoured event. Australia has a deep and abiding defence relationship with Singapore, one in which Singapore Armed Forces have trained in Australia for more than 30 years. And I'm looking forward to working with my counterpart, Dr. Ng En Hen. I also want to acknowledge my fellow panellists from Malaysia and Qatar, Senior Minister Dato Seri Hishamuddin and Dr. Khalid bin Mohammed Al Attiyah. Malaysia is one of Australia's closest defence partners. Our two-way secondment program is the largest in Southeast Asia. We both work with Singapore as part of the five-power defence arrangement, which has been an anchor of regional security for more than 50 years. And Australia and Qatar are long-time friends and partners, including through our contribution to the US-led global coalition to defeat Daesh. Indeed, in 2017, I visited the Combined Air Operations Centre and I saw firsthand the contribution and importance of Qatar's role in hosting this facility. Under Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, Australia will take our place in the world with confidence, and we will bring new energy to our relationships with old friends. Australia will embark on a new era of engagement with the Pacific. Indeed, we already have. Our Foreign Affairs Minister, Penny Wong, has visited several Pacific Island countries, and those who know me will be aware that I can't wait to visit the Pacific as soon as I possibly can. Indeed, the Pacific has been a passion of mine since I first visited Papua New Guinea as a 16-year-old in 1984. It's home to many of my friends. It's a place that still amazes me. Its peoples and cultures are astonishing and unique, and fundamental to the world's human heritage. Australia will become a more engaged and responsive partner to our Pacific neighbours. But this requires effort. It requires respect and a willingness to listen. We want to earn the trust of the countries of the Pacific to be their natural partner of choice. The Australian Defence Force will always be there for our Pacific neighbours, be it in response to natural and humanitarian disasters, or the complex array of security issues we now mutually face. And this includes establishing an Australian Pacific Defence School to train the Pacific Island Defence and Security Forces. We will help deter illegal fishing and transnational crime through more support for Australia's Pacific Maritime Security Program. Australia is committed to the countries of the Pacific because we are a Pacific country too. We share in each other's security, and we believe that Pacific security challenges need Pacific security solutions, consistent with regional agreements and processes such as the Pacific Island Forum and the Boy Declaration. The new Australian government will also revitalise our historically deep engagement with Southeast Asia. In 1974, Australia became the first dialogue partner of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations under Labor Prime Minister Gough Whitlam. Since then, ASEAN countries have been at the heart of both Australia's security and economic interests and our vision of the Indo-Pacific. Modern Australia is now home to many diaspora communities from Southeast Asia. Indeed, our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, began her life in Kota Kinabalu in Malaysia. It's why Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's first bilateral international visit was to Indonesia. And it's also why Australia will tighten military ties with Southeast Asia. We will appoint an ASEAN Special Envoy. We are committed to the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting Plus framework as the preeminent regional defence forum. And we are committed to working with Southeast Asia to support ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific. The Australian government will have a renewed focus on climate change. As Prime Minister Albanese said, climate change is not just about the environment. It's about lives. It's about livelihoods. It's about national security. In 2011, I addressed the UN Security Council on the security implications of climate change. I did so with my friend Marcus Stephen, the then President of Nauru. And at the time I spoke about coral atoll nations like the Marshall Islands. Indeed, when one stands on the shores of Majuro, which I have, with nowhere else to go, with the sea on either side of that thin strip of land, one senses the intense vulnerability felt by those living on small islands. The sea, which has long been a source of food, of sustenance and culture, is being transformed into a source of anxiety and threat. Climate change will drive destabilising population movements as people's lives and livelihoods are increasingly at risk. And this in turn will give rise to new security challenges. Our government's approach to climate change demonstrates how seriously we take our place in the world. Our target is a national emissions reduction of 43% by 2030 on the road to net zero by 2050. Gone are the days when Australia neglected climate change as a security issue and treated it as a marginal priority. Australia is back at the table as a responsible, sensible, thoughtful and purposeful actor. Climate change will now factor into Australia's defence planning and defence diplomacy. Under Anthony Albanese, you will also see a change in Australia's tone. It's in the character of Australians to be frank. We will always be forthright in articulating our national interest and in advocating for our region's security. But this government will be respectful, including with countries where we have complex relationships, and that includes China. Australia values a productive relationship with China. China is not going anywhere, and we all need to live together and hopefully prosper together. China remains Australia's largest trading partner. China's economic success is connected to that of our own and the region. So Australia's approach will be anchored in a resolve to safeguard our national interest and our support for regional security and stability based on rules. We will be steady and consistent, looking for avenues of cooperation where they exist, while recognising China's growing power and the manner in which that is reshaping our region. Australia's strategic circumstances are as complex as they have been since the end of the Second World War. We want to see a region at peace, not in conflict. A region where the sovereignty of all nations, large and small, is preserved, and where the rule of law, not the rule of power, governs conduct between states. Much has been said about the need for the United States to respond to China's rise in a way that responsibly manages strategic competition, but also allows the regional order to adapt. But that imposes responsibility on China as well. Former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating observed that China has an equal responsibility for a stable and sustainable order in our region. He said, as China steps up to a larger leadership role, it will at the same time need to be willing to accept and respect restraints on the way it uses its immense strength, because the acceptance of such restraints by great powers is the key to any successful and durable international order. Of course, it's reasonable to expect a more powerful China will have a bigger say in regional and international affairs. But what's important is that the exercise of Chinese power exhibits the characteristics necessary for our shared prosperity and security. Respect for agreed rules and norms, with trade and investment flows based on agreed rules and binding treaty commitments, and where disputes amongst states are resolved via dialogue and in accordance with international law. This is vital when it comes to the rearmament we are witnessing in the Indo-Pacific. Australia does not question the right of any country to modernise their military capabilities consistent with their interests and resources. But large-scale military build-ups must be transparent, and they must be accompanied by statecraft that reassures. China's military build-up is now the largest and most ambitious we have seen by any country since the end of the Second World War. And so it's critical that China's neighbours do not see this build-up as a risk to them, because without that reassurance, it is inevitable that countries will seek to upgrade their own military capabilities in response. Insecurity is what drives an arms race. So reassuring statecraft is essential. It's essential to providing confidence that global rules apply everywhere, that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea applies in all international waters, including the South China Sea. Chinese militarisation of features in the South Chinese Sea needs to be understood for what it is: the intent to deny the legitimacy of its neighbours' claims in this vital international waterway through force. Reassuring statecraft will be fundamental to peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. Reassuring statecraft will be fundamental to better relations between China and India, China and South Korea, and China and Australia. And it's critical that the global community acts as one in calling out threats to peace. The UN Security Council should be allowed to condemn North Korea's illegal ballistic missile tests. It should be able to call for the restoration of civilian government in Myanmar. Russian disinformation on Ukraine should be exposed, not amplified. The return of war in Europe should be a warning to us all. The war Russia has embarked on demonstrates that we cannot just rely on economic interdependence to deter conflict. On the contrary, it demonstrates that interdependence is no barrier when one country's determined military build-up creates an imbalance of military power, an imbalance that encouraged Moscow to conclude the benefits from conflict outweighed the risks. This has been a catastrophic misjudgment by Russia. That's why Australia is standing with Europe, not only to prevent the brutal subjugation of a sovereign state, but also to reject the idea that any power has a right to dominate its neighbour. The global rules-based order matters everywhere. It's therefore reasonable to expect China make clear it does not support the invasion of a sovereign state in violation of the UN Charter and China's own long-standing commitment to the Charter's founding principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. That China has not done so should give us cause for concern, especially given the investments it is making now in its military power. When it comes to the security and stability of our own region, there will be continuity in Australian defence policy. Australia's 70-year-old alliance with the United States has never been more important to our nation, and deep US engagement has never been more important to the stability and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific. There'll be no cuts to Australia's defence spending. The Albanese government has committed to spending 2% of GDP on defence, including to enhance the Australian Defence Force with capabilities outlined in the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, like long-range and precision strike weapons, offensive and defensive cyber, and aerial denial systems. AUKUS, which Labor supported in opposition, will be central. It will not only deliver nuclear-powered submarines for Australia, but also guide accelerated development of advanced defence capabilities where they have most impact, such as quantum technology, artificial intelligence, undersea warfare, hypersonics and counter-hypersonics. As we move forward with AUKUS, Australia will ensure that we do so in a way that strengthens the global nuclear non-proliferation regime, a regime that few countries have done as much as Australia to support. AUKUS, of course, does not limit our ambition to do more with other partners, especially Japan and India. I travel to Japan on Monday, where I will meet my counterpart as we deepen technology capability and operational cooperation. And I look forward to visiting India soon to take forward the defence pillar of our comprehensive strategic partnership. Australia is open about why and how we are investing in defence capability, and we will continue to be so. We are proud of our record of transparency. Australia's investments in defence capability are a necessary and prudent response to the military build-up we see taking place in the Indo-Pacific. Importantly, these investments are not only about Australia's security, they are about the region's security as well, because they aim to contribute to an effective balance of military power, a balance that ensures no state will ever conclude here that the benefits of conflict outweigh the risks, a balance in which the peace achieved by past generations and from which we prosper today can be our shared legacy for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Defence, for a very rich speech, for your promise for Australia to be an engaged and responsive partner of the Pacific, for your commitment to climate change as part of defence diplomacy and planning. I might even add potentially as part of defence doctrine, for your call for reassuring statecraft. And of course, reassuring statecraft is exactly what defence diplomacy is all about. Deputy Prime Minister of Qatar, Dr. Khalid Mohammed Al Attiyah, floor is yours. That was excellent, really.
Thank you, Dr. Chapman, and colleagues, member of the panel, Excellency Hisham Al-Din and Excellency Marlis Richard. Good morning to you all. I am pleased to take part in this year's dialogue, a welcome return to normalcy. Thank you to our generous host, the Government of Singapore, for its warm welcome and excellent hospitality. This year's summit is a testament to the significance of the dialogue in promoting face-to-face diplomacy, with the aim of discussing and ultimately resolving the most pressing security challenges affecting this region and beyond. This year is a particularly special year for the state of Qatar, as we are gearing up to host the World Cup 2022. I echo His Highness the Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad in saying that we are extremely proud of the development made by the state of Qatar and are thankful for the spotlight provided by the World Cup that has inspired in many ways and expedite our country development in many areas, chiefly those development made in infrastructure and policies. Sport has an extraordinary effect on people, where it is able to unite in excitement and driven even the most diverse of people. Sport, in its best form, is a game of integrity and teamwork, where your best effort are rewarded and your limitations are supplemented by your teammates. And that sport can be a true source of inspiration for world diplomacy. As we look at the new forms of security cooperation during this session, the exploration of any such form must be driven by an object to unite and a protective approach to security through collective strength building, aimed at bettering and advancing security, rather than limiting and deterring other securities. It is only through a collective approach to security is true security achievable. The game of one-upmanship has undoubtedly expedited innovation in the security sector, but has left many either bystander to innovation or isolated in their limitation. The state of Qatar is fortunate with the abundance of resource, resilience of its people, and vision of its leadership. Much of my country resources have been directed toward advancing our people through education, R&D, and providing world-class healthcare. In the area of security, the focus on increasing securities through first building a well-trained and equipped forces ready to protect our border with 360 degrees focus on security has been coupled with advancing traditional forms of security, cooperation with allies and partners. In intelligence sharing, interoperability, peacekeeping, initiative, training, and education. In examining new forms of security cooperation, I took a step back to observe our current realities and extract some lessons learned from past and current world events. What became instantly clear is that in time of conflict, there seemed to be a collective knee-jerk reaction, is to expel and punish those whom we deem as perpetrator. Isolation is seen as the greatest punishment of those offenders. We know that isolation, as demonstrated throughout history, further emboldens and reaffirms sentiment of wrongdoing rather than extinguishes the flame of aggression. When also, as observed through history, transgressions are dealt with firmly, yet those whom find themselves defeated are assimilated back into the structure of global diplomacy. Peace is built and social and economic prosperity is assured in. Safeguarding the right of state within collective framework rather than maneuvering around the letter of the law to ostracize furthers the integrity of this institution and complies member to uphold its structures. Today, we often discuss global previous pivots of rebalances. With every pivot made, there are those left behind. I propose that rather than pivoting toward something else, whether it be a region, emerging market, or political dialogue, or political ideology, the mission become expanding on and fortifying of global platforms that are designed to lead the global economy, political and social reform and advancement. By consolidating and expanding on this members only clubs, an inclusive and sustainable model for growth and cooperation can finally be met. The current structure of this global member-only club, with top-tier membership enjoying privileges that other paying members do not, reinforce traditional heretical system, proven time and again to be limited in vision, not to mention disfranchising and at time polarizing. An equitable system of cooperation must be established first, if there is any hope of exploring new and innovative forms to sustainable global security and other forms of cooperation. I am often asked about Qatar balancing game, how we are able to maintain relation, whether defense, political or commerce, with one power in presence of another. It is here that I am best able to stress the fact that Qatar simply does not play any games. We know who we are, our shortcoming, and all we know what we stand for, and for following our own distinct and bespoke roadmap in the form of Qatar National Vision 2030. Our character is known to all. When you deal with the state of Qatar, you know exactly who you are dealing with, an honest and reliable partner that will never hesitate to tell you the truth. Qatar's honest efforts are evident in many ongoing global issues, from the refugee crisis of Afghanistan to the plight of the Palestinians and the rebuilding effort of Lebanon. We do not score in time of difficulty or punish individuals for their fakeliness by withholding our best effort from their people. Some might attempt to paint any effort exerted by the state of Qatar as self-serving. To that I say, our global actions are led by our desire to serve our interest of global cohesion and peace. We understand fully that aggression serves a few, but peace and its byproduct, economy, prosperity, serve us all. Historically, survivalist tactics of security cooperation are reactive and often destructive, fortifying one perimeter of land while leaving another exposed. For security to be sustainable and resilient, it must be inclusive, just like football. The shortcoming of one player must be covered by its teammates if there is any hope for success. I thank you again and look forward to a robust discussion and surely a successful dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khalid, for those remarks, and particularly for your concluding phrase that for security to be resilient, it has to be inclusive, and that surely must be our general goal, however difficult the path to getting there might be. We have 30 minutes left in this session. I think I'll conduct it in the same way as I did the previous one, with the prior agreement of our three panelists, which is to invite a dozen or so crisp interventions from the floor, and then giving each of our panelists a chance to give their answers to the questions posed. And I'll begin with Chu Ping Hu from Malaysia, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sri Hishamuddin, for your speech. You raised a lot of concerns, domestically, regional, and also global. And there seems to have a lot of coordination gaps that exist not only in Malaysia, but also at the regional level. I agree that multilateralism can be one of the approaches to tackle those problems that you mentioned. However, don't you think that from our national principles, from KESBAN, meaning Keselamatan dan Pembangunan, Security and Development Nexus, to what we now hold up as the Pertahanan Menyeluruh Comprehensive Defense. So how do you think Malaysia should prioritize strengthening our multilateral and multilateral cooperation with selective powers to assert our autonomy while also maintain territorial integrity in South China Sea and also in terms of our borders integrity? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And from France, Camille Lons.
Thank you. I would have a question for Minister Khalid Al-Attiyah. Gulf countries appear a little bit on the margins of the Indo-Pacific region, but in reality, the prosperity and the economic security of the two regions has grown increasingly interconnected. Do you think that this economic interdependence and especially energy interdependence will lead to a greater political and security integration between the two regions? How is Qatar preparing to navigate between great power competition in the Indo-Pacific? And what do you think should be the role of Asian powers in Gulf security? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And from China, Wenhua Zhao. Your microphone is on. Sorry, just take the microphone and thank you.
非常感谢三位国。
I would like to thank the three ministers of defense for sharing your views on this topic on developing new security cooperation models. Today's topic is about new security models. This morning, Secretary of Defense from the United States, Austin, shared his views and approach in regional security partnership. He spent 30 minutes on these views. As someone from the academic circle, I do not very much agree with some of his views. Minister from Australia, Miles, also mentioned AUKUS, which was established last year in this region. Once it was established, it immediately attracted a lot of attention by Asian countries, also led to concerns about nuclear proliferation. My question to Minister Miles is, do you think AUKUS, do you think in the Asia-Pacific region, AUKUS is the best security cooperation model in this region? Is this a mini NATO or an Asia-Pacific version of NATO? Thank you very much.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Deputy Prime Minister from Australia. You mentioned about the strengthening partnership with Southeast Asia and Pacific Islands within the broader Indo-Pacific region framework. In 2020, the defense strategy of US mentioned about Northeast Indian Ocean being its priority area. I want to know, within your new government, where does the Western Indian Ocean stand within the broader Indo-Pacific region? And apart from with India, cooperation with India, how do you see the cooperation with other countries in the Western Indian Ocean Pacific region? Thank you.
Thank you. And from the UK, Anton LaGuardia. Anton.
Thank you very much. A question to Mr. Hisham Mohammed, which is the minilateralism that you talk about compatible with other minilateral arrangements in Asia, for example, the Quad or the partnership between America, Japan, and Australia? And to Minister Miles, you spoke of continuity in Australia's defence policy. Your predecessor spoke about the probability that Australia would become involved in any contingency involving Taiwan. Is that also your view?
Thank you so much. And then from Japan, Daisuke Kawai.
Thank you. My question is to Minister Miles. During the election campaign, the Minister Albanese said he will promote disarmament and non-proliferation. But on the other hand, in the Tokyo Quad Leaders Summit, he also mentioned he will keep AUKUS, the framework. But it sounds inconsistent policy, as AUKUS is heavily related to nuclear matters. So what do you think about this? What is the exact direction the new administration is moving forward? Thank you.
And from the Philippines, Meli Calabero Anthony.
Thank you. I'd like to take off from Dr. Khalid's concluding statement about the need for security cooperation frameworks to be more inclusive rather than exclusive. Minister Hishamuddin talked about food security, which he mentioned as global transnational challenges. And yet, some of the security frameworks that we're seeing, even if they are sub-regional, tends to increase fragmentation rather than a more collective approach. So my question, I guess, to all panelists, whoever wants to take this, is would this emerging minilateralism add to more fragmentation and weaken the need, rather, to have collective responses for transnational security challenges? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And from Australia, Michael Fullerlove.
Thank you. My question is for Richard Marles. Congratulations on your election and on the energy, purpose and dispatch that the new government has shown in the first few weeks of office, and on your strong and clear remarks today. Let me ask you about Australia's relations with China. China has made some overtures to the new government, but if it wants to reset relations, then seeking to wrap up the whole of the Pacific in a region-wide security pact and intercepting an RAAF surveillance plane in international airspace is a strange way to do it. So is maintaining sanctions on many of our exports. You mentioned avenues of cooperation with China. Does that require Beijing first to dismantle the roadblocks they've erected across those avenues?
And from Germany, Maybrit Stambaum.
Thank you very much. I just follow on from Mr. Fullerlove about the relationship with China should be a respectful one. You said China's not going anywhere, but you also said that it's all about keeping the global rules-based order. I can tell you in Europe, the Ukraine war really had a huge impact on the public to understanding that maintaining the global rule-based order is really something that affects everybody of us. So you only mentioned about deepening relationship, AUKUS, the US, but also Japan and India. So I would like to draw you again to Europe. We talked about France already before. Germany, as you know, has a strategic partnership with you. We had a 2+2 consultation with a very long list of cooperation and tech cooperation, dual-use areas, defense, high-tech, cyber, climate change, space. So I was wondering where you would see the collaboration with European partners, also Germany in this regard, as it is part of our coalition agreement, where the Albanese administration is going. Is that going through NATO, or is that going through bilateral for, like, what would be the areas you go for? Thank you.
Thank you. Ewan Graham from the UK.
Thank you. My question is for Richard Marles. Minister, you said that transparency is something that Australia is proud of, and that Australians have a reputation for being frank. I think since becoming minister, you've also said that you have no intention currently to undertake a new defence white paper. Given that, could you flesh out through what alternative means you do practically aim to achieve transparency, both in terms of how Australia conducts its defence relations and explains its capability choices to partners in the region, but also domestically to the Australian public, given the very large sums of public money that are currently being spent in some complicated and in other cases problematic procurement decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. And from Singapore, Jayan Chop.
Thank you. So my question is for both Minister Marles and Mr. Hishammuddin. So both of you have talked in various ways about reassurance, trust, cooperation, but you've also talked both about disinformation. So my question here is, when we see disinformation being pushed out by state actors, actors that potentially you have to engage, how do your ideas about trust, reassurance, and cooperation fit in when some of this action seems contrary to these sorts of aims that you have just espoused? Thank you.
And from France, Sébastien Faletti.
Hello. Yes. Good morning. I have a question for Mr. Marles. You mentioned about the strategy for the region. I heard before the French minister, Mr. Lecornu, mentioned also about Australia, but we know that there was an agreement announced this morning to settle the deal between Naval Group and Australia regarding the submarine deal. So could you explain a bit what direction you would see for a potential resuming of cooperation with France in the Pacific and in the security field? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the last question before I come back to the panel will be from Japan, Chikaku Ueki.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chapman. If I may ask Minister Marles, about the cooperation of the US, Japan, Australia. The three countries share a same vision of the creating and maintaining a rules-based order, more specifically how we can make China observe the rules. Unfortunately, although the cooperation has increased, we haven't been very successful in our strategic goal of making China observe the rules. So 2 questions. Do you see any areas of our cooperation in this strategy that could be either rectified, improved, enhanced, that would able to maintain China that observes by the rules? And the second question is on the military front. Do you see any areas or one top priority of areas that the allies need to enhance? If you see any areas of that needs to be enhanced and acquired. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So let me explain the diplomatic attitude of the chair here. If I've counted properly, it would not be fair to the panelists if I gave each of them 5 minutes each. It would put Mr. Morales in an extremely underprivileged position, given that, if I counted correctly, 3/4 of the questions came to him. So fairness requires the application of emotionally intelligent disproportionality. So Khalid, you got a big question about the relationship between the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. You've got 2 minutes for that. Richard Marles, you've got 8 questions. I'm going to give you 7 minutes for that. And Hishamuddin, you've got 3 minutes for the 3 ones you got. I hope you all consider that fair in the circumstances that have confronted me. Khalid.
Yes, thank you very much, John. I would like to answer to Camelia about the question, how do we balance, and maybe I have noticed or mentioned this previously in my speech. In Qatar, we would like always to consider ourselves as a platform for all our friends to exchange their thought and to use it as a bridge to close the gap if there is differences, or to mediate if possible. We, as a small state, would like to be a friend with everyone, and this is how we build our policy always. In the energy sector, we never see ourselves in Qatar as a competitor to any supplier or any other countries. We always see ourselves as complementary to other supplier. Our strategy is safe and stability supply to the world, and never compete with anyone. This is how we manage our good relationship with all our friends, whether in the East or in the West. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Khalid. Richard, over to you.
I'll do my best. Let me start with the question from the delegate from China. AUKUS is not a mini NATO. AUKUS is principally about the sharing and joint development of capability between Australia, the UK and the United States. And that is what its direction is. It's not an alliance, and so it's not in the same set of arrangements as you would describe NATO. It is a technology sharing relationship, and that will be its focus. And in that sense, it does not, as I said in my remarks, detract at all from the ambitious agenda we have to build and improve our relationships within Asia and within the Indo-Pacific. From the delegate from Sri Lanka, the Indian Ocean is really important to Australia. We've been, as a nation, well served in the last 15 years by a couple of West Australian foreign ministers, one of whom's in the room right now, Stephen Smith and Julie Bishop, who I think have helped us as a nation understand that so many of our interests lie west, in South Asia and in the Indian Ocean. And that's a really important realisation for the country, both in terms of our security framework, but also in terms of economic opportunity. And that obviously applies in the context of India, and you see a range of regional architecture evolving, which involves both Australia and India, but it absolutely includes the other countries in the Indian Ocean and Sri Lanka. There's a growing relationship between Australia and Sri Lanka, underpinned not least by a pretty significant Sri Lankan Australian community. Indeed, at the last election a few weeks ago, we had the first Sri Lankan Australian elected to our federal parliament, a member of the Labor Party, Cassandra Fernando. And that speaks to the significance of the community in Australia, but it also speaks to how importantly we regard the relationship with Sri Lanka and the emphasis that we will place upon it. From the delegate from UK, a question was asked of me in respect of Taiwan. Australia has very productive relationships with Taiwan, but we have a one China policy. None of that changes with a change of government. It has been consistent bipartisan policy in Australia over a very long period of time. And as part of that, we see that what will serve the region and the world is that the resolution of tensions in respect of the Taiwan Straits is done so in a way which is peaceful and which involves the mutual agreement of both sides of the Taiwan Strait. And in terms of Australia's involvement, all we would seek to do is play whatever role we could in facilitating that. From the delegate from Japan, in respect of the question was asked about AUKUS and implications in relation to Australia's commitment to non-proliferation. Australia has a deep commitment to non-proliferation. Indeed, Anthony Albanese, as Prime Minister throughout his political life, has been completely committed to non-proliferation. And as I said in my remarks, we have a proud record as a nation in participating in non-proliferation activities, and we will continue to do so. What AUKUS does for Australia is help us move to a nuclear-propelled submarine. Not a nuclear-armed submarine, but a nuclear-propelled submarine. It will also give rise to cooperation in technological exchange in relation to other defence capabilities, but not nuclear weapons. And so AUKUS is completely consistent with Australia's involvement in non-proliferation, and indeed Anthony Albanese and Labor's commitment to that. To Michael, thank you for your comment, your congratulations. I appreciate it. You asked me the question in relation to China. China, from where we sit, seeks to shape the world around it in a way that we've not experienced before. It raises challenges for Australia, challenges that we intend to meet. In all that we do, we will have the courage to articulate Australia's national interest, and particularly when that differs from Chinese action. And I hope I've demonstrated that in the remarks I made today. Our interest in the Pacific is going to be served by Australia focusing on the Pacific, which we mean to do. What we're going to do is put in the work to build an enhanced long-standing relationship so that we are the natural partner of choice for the countries of the Pacific. That's our focus. In respect to the South China Sea, we will engage in activities which promote the global rules-based order applying to that body of water, including freedom of navigation, because it goes to our national interest given that most of our trade traverses the South China Sea. So we'll be focused on our national interest. That said, China is our largest trading partner, and we will engage with China with respect, in acknowledging China as a country with whom we have very significant interests, including our trade, we are clear that we value the relationship with China and we want to move it forward. And it's really in respect to, with those goals in mind that we are going to move forward in terms of our relationship with China. Delegate from Germany, Europe is really important to Australia, and yes, it is about engaging through NATO as we do, and indeed the Prime Minister, I think this is public, will be attending the NATO Leaders Summit in Madrid in a couple of weeks. But we also are really focused on the bilateral relations of the countries of Europe, and we have really deep interests with the countries of Europe, which include Germany. And Germany is involved in a number of our defence procurements right now in terms of our offshore patrol vessels with Lursen, in terms of armoured personnel carriers with Rheinmetall. These actually elevate the significance of the bilateral relationship with Germany, and we're keen to continue to do that. And that probably is a segue into the question from France. We have announced a settlement in relation with Naval Group in relation to the former contract in respect of what was to be the attack class submarines. We've done that pretty quickly because we want to really move on from that and reset the relationship with France. France is a critical relationship for Australia. The nearest overseas population to the southeast corner of Australia, to the cities of Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra, is in France. It's Noumea in New Caledonia. If you include maritime borders, France's longest border with any country in the world is with Australia. We don't think about it enough, but in fact, France is our nearest neighbour, and that's how we want to see it. They're a Pacific country and a liberal democracy engaged in the Pacific, and we deeply, deeply value that. And I've had the pleasure of working with France in the past when I was responsible for Australia's relations with the Pacific, and we really want to revitalise, reset, reinvigorate our relationship with France. From another question from UK around transparency, we're not interested in doing a white paper and devoting all the resources that would imply. We do, however, want to do a force posture review, and as part of that, look at the question of force structure, and that will be an opportunity to give transparency to the region, to the world, about how Australia is behaving in terms of our defence build-up. It will also be a means by which we communicate with the country. But those reviews are important. I can tell you as Defence Minister, it will be my style to be very clear to the Australian people about where defence policy lies and why we're making the decisions that we're making, and I'll be very clear with bodies such as this and indeed with the global community in the same way. Finally, there was a question from Japan, I hope I'm within the time limit, around US-Japan-Australia cooperation. That trilateral relationship, I think, is really important. And I guess the question was asked, how are we going in terms of our influence in respect of China? Probably won't answer that question. It's ultimately for others to judge. But I guess what I would say is this. In a context of really complex strategic circumstances, I don't have the answers to all the ways in which we navigate those circumstances, but one thing is really clear to me. There's never been a more important time to compare notes and to work closely with countries which share those strategic circumstances. And Japan and the United States are two countries which do. When I look forward, I think that, and focusing on, obviously our alliance with the United States is completely central to our worldview. It is the most important relationship in which we have, and as I mentioned in my remarks, will continue to be so, and we see that the alliance has never been more important. In terms of our relationship with Japan, when I look forward, and it's why I'm going to Japan the day after tomorrow, I think that is going to be fundamentally important to Australia's future, and I only see growth in that relationship. And finally, in respect of the military cooperation, working together on technological cooperation, but working together on operational interoperability is perhaps two comments I'd make to offer ways in which we can grow that relationship, but we mean for it to be deep, and we see that there is a reciprocity in feeling on the part of Japan.
Richard, thank you very much. That was excellent, crisp, and comprehensive. Just before I hand over to Hisham Uden, the IISS spends a lot of time working on nuclear issues and non-proliferation. And just to add one fact to what the Deputy Prime Minister said, the International Atomic Energy Authority has been very careful to endorse the AUKUS agreement as passing the strictest of all non-proliferation tests, and the strictest of all non-proliferation tests are the ones normally applied by the IAEA, and he has praised the transparency of the three countries involved in engaging with that organization on what the agreement is really all about. I just introduced that fact into the discussion without taking any further position on it.
Thanks, John. Firstly, on disinformation. Disinformation is something that we need to address, whether it is state-sponsored or not. How and the manner in which we address it depends on our priority, depends on the interests of our nations. And the way that we manage to deal with it would depend very much on the bigger worldview. Malaysia, for example, is divided, is diversified by race, by religion, by culture. And any disinformation, we have decided that from the beginning in which we first achieved independence, that affects the situation in Malaysia on that divide, we will give it full priority. Anything to do, any disinformation that divides us because of religion, anything that divides us between race, that needs to be nipped in the bud completely. Disinformation regionally, ASEAN leaders have, from the formation of ASEAN, has made it very clear that the trust that we have built up in ASEAN, these 10 nations, will not allow any agenda or disinformation to divide us. That's what we always mean by the centrality of ASEAN. And General Tiban, Admiral Teo, nodding their heads to me. It's not easy to deal with it. But the fact that we have been able to do this over the years, what we have inherited from our forefathers, have allowed us to be able to deal with this disinformation for the betterment of our region. And that is something that we need to emphasize on, the continuous building of trust and comfort between leaders in our country. Okay, there's a limit that you want to be a populist. There's a limit in which you want to get votes. But if it touches on race, if it touches on the very fabric of the Malaysian society, that is when you need clear, strong, courageous leadership to deal with disinformation of that nature. State-sponsored disinformation, if the relationship between us is strong enough, we will be able to deal with it. If not, we won't be sitting here in Singapore, in the Shangri-La Dialogue, looking to the future, with all the ASEAN leaders this morning having seen the SecDef of the United States, later on with the General Wei of China. This morning, I had a very, very early breakfast on the FPDA, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia, Malaysia. We have built the FPDA 51 years ago. Now, are you telling me that 51 years of relationship between these 5 nations are going to be disrupted because of disinformation? If we allow that to happen, we're not very responsible leaders today. And that applies to ASEAN too. And these 10 nations have been through a lot to get to where we are today. And I think the least of our problems is really to deal with the amount of information that's out there. But the fear that I have is not enough time is spent building the relationship between the leaders of our nations. Multilateralism and minilateralism. We don't have to have one above the other. You can have both. The trilateral that we have established in the Sulu Seas, in the Sulawesi Seas, involving Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, if you look at multilateralism, it would not have worked. Philippines have a claim on Sabah. All three countries are claimant states in South China Sea. So basically, if we allowed multilateralism to proceed, how are we going to deal with the immediate problem of kidnappers, of the terrorists in Mindanao? So yes, we continue with the existing structures and landscape that we have or inherited from our forefathers. But in the meantime, we'll be creative enough to be able to look at a situation where there's a common threat, a sharing of a common sea with a common aim to establish something more constructive without disturbing what we have inherited. Finally is on the issue of coordination in the Indo-Pacific. If you're talking about coordination in the South China Sea, my biggest fear has always in the past, it's not about rhetoric, it's not about who we are aligned to. Malaysia has got no pretensions. We are not a superpower. We cannot decide whether these superpowers build artificial islands or we don't have big aircraft carriers to stop that from happening. But basically, 10 nations in ASEAN is able to decide on its own destiny. And no superpower could take that away from us. So on the issue of coordination, it is very much the ability for us to be united. And as I said in my speech, these 10 nations will have to chart the future, which is getting much more complicated and much more complex. But in the same breath, I hope that the superpowers are able to respect that we do have our own pride, our own dignity, and we will defend our independence and our right to the last breath.
Thank you very much. I think that's a perfect note on which to end a long morning. May I all ask you to thank our guests. Thank you very much indeed. Have a splendid lunch, and we'll see you all precisely at 2:30 this afternoon, and then again at 4 p.m. for the special address by President Zelensky. Thank you very much indeed to all of you.